Microgrids is maybe one of the hottest topics in the industry these days. It's been around for a little bit. It's not brand new, but there's certainly a lot of developments happening across the industry. My name's Steve Hauser. I'm the CEO of the Gridwise Alliance. We're a nonprofit group that represents stakeholders across the industry that have been advocating for changes in the industry for almost 2 decades now, and I can tell you all sorts of stories, sort of been there, done that. I didn't warn these guys, but in terms of my qualifications on the topic of microgrids, about 4 years ago, I was the president of a company who had a rather large contract to design and build a microgrid for the Navy, for the U.S. Navy. And I can probably tell you more stories about how it doesn't work and the problems you have and the opportunities for improvements. So these guys are now going to tell us how they've figured out all of that. It all works now. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We'll start down at the far end. So there's John, Mark, and Jake. And we'll start with John. Just give a brief introduction, and then we'll come back here and Jake will kick it off.
Thank you. I'm John Pinho. I'm the Senior Program and Project Manager at Arizona Public Service. I'm responsible for microgrid and battery storage and electrification development and implementation.
I'm Mark Martyak. I'm Chief Sales Officer of the Distributed Infrastructure Group at PowerSecure. We do microgrids on a turnkey basis, and I'm very blessed to be sitting in between 2 really great customers today.
My name is Jakob Carnemark. I'm the founder and the CTO of Aligned Energy. We develop and build data centers throughout the U.S. And also technologies underlying them. And I guess I'll kind of continue and kind of set it up from a customer perspective. So I think everybody knows what a data center is, and everybody's heard of cloud and massive growth, always in the news today. From a power perspective, what happens in a data center is, if you think about a traditional commercial office building, it's about 6 watts a foot. Data centers today can go up to 2,000 watts a foot. So massive energy intensity in data centers. What Aligned has done to kind of address some of the issues in data centers is, number one, we've focused on making data centers much more efficient to cool. A server gives off as much heat as you pump electricity into it. So a typical server rack today can go up to 40,000 watts. So think, although I don't have hair, I always think in terms of hair dryers, because everybody knows what a hair dryer outputs as heat. So think about that, 40 hair dryers blowing in a typical data center that we build could be 100 megawatts of power. So these are massive facilities. And one of the issues that's kind of plagued data centers is you don't know what's going to show up as IT tomorrow, let alone 10 years from now. So there's been significant underutilization problems because you always want to build enough so you have enough cooling, you have enough power. And so data centers have massive electrical infrastructure. They have energy storage, and that's in case the grid goes out, obviously, and also to bridge you till you get your generation started. So one of the things that struck me in 25 years of building data centers is we spend a lot of money on generation assets and battery assets that just sit there waiting for the power to go out. And wouldn't it be great if we could be much more working with the utilities on better business models to kind of conjoin those assets, right? Doesn't make any sense for us as data center developers to be spending money on something when it can't be used by the grid, and the grid goes out and spends the same money. And when you look at the problem kind of holistically and what's going on the grid today, our customers are wonderful green companies, all the big brand names, and they want to offset their carbon footprint of their data centers, and they have hundreds and hundreds of megawatts, which is a great thing to do. But essentially, every time they build a data center, which are these massive loads, they're also putting on the grid uncorrelated variable supply in things like wind and solar. So the problems of grid balancing and frequency balancing just escalate. So and you guys have heard a lot in the breakout sessions. So what we wanted to do with our data center asset is create a much more reliable asset by partnering with utility, finding the right, vertically integrated vendor to work with, so that we could build a data center that was not only much more reliable, but also develop a better business model. And that's kind of the setup and the why. And then I'll kick it over to you guys to kind of, maybe Mark dive into a little bit of the details, and John.
Okay. So as I said earlier, PowerSecure, we're a turnkey provider of microgrids. We actually have about 2.5 gigawatts of active microgrids around the country. And it's always surprising. We get invited to speak at a lot of conferences like this, and at a lot of the conferences, I'm always surprised because microgrids are still kind of being addressed as some kind of science experiment. And we actually have 2.5 gigawatts of commercially viable microgrids. Obviously, the landscape of our utility grid is changing. If you all heard about the duck curve with the more solar we have, now utilities are dealing with the under-frequency problem when the sun comes up in the morning, or the over-frequency problem as the sun comes up in the morning, they try to ramp down capacity. And then an under-frequency problem at the end of the day when the sun is setting and they got to ramp up capacity. Turns out that these microgrids and generation, like we have at all these data centers, can respond very quickly, and if they're set up right initially with proper EPA super clean emissions, they're actually cleaner than a lot of peaking utility sources would be, and they can respond much faster. So you can take these assets that are stranded, these battery assets that are stranded, generation assets that are stranded, and actually help the utility grid. Another thing that's changed is, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, you talk to a data center, they say, nobody's touching my generation. My generation is standby only, nobody's touching my UPS, it's just there for that. That attitude is changing considerably. And the reason for that is it turns out that when you integrate these assets, on-site generation and UPS assets with the grid, you actually make the system inherently more reliable. And we actually have all of our data from our 2.5 gigawatts of microgrids go directly to M Technology. It's a branch of MIT. And their sole function is to calculate statistical reliability. Turns out, and they will say this, they've actually published it, that PowerSecure microgrids are 2.5 times less likely to fail than any other industry power supply. And it's because of this grid integration that we do with assets like Jake.
From a utility perspective, in 2014 when I joined APS, I was brought in specifically because I was not from the utility. I worked mostly behind the meter in a lot of high-tech, mission-critical facilities, and I was brought in so the utility could learn how to attract customers like Jake to our territory because I knew the problems and issues that they faced. And Mark and Jake are both right. We viewed originally microgrids as a threat to the utility. We thought all these commercial customers were going to come in, or communities, build microgrids, cut the cable, and we'd see revenue erosion. So we started talking to a lot of our larger customers about, would you be considering a microgrid? Do you know what a microgrid is? And almost all of them came back and said, yeah, we've heard of microgrids, but you know what? Energy is not our core competency. Even if we had a microgrid, we would still want to keep the cord because we know you're reliable. We know that you have a history of reliability, and we also know microgrids are expensive. So we went and thought about this and said, how can we turn what we consider a threat into an opportunity? And that's when we met up with Jake and his team and Mark, and together we came up with a new business model where the utility partners with the customer, and we actually operate and maintain the microgrid for the customer. So consider it microgrid as a service. And we're a fully regulated utility. So our portion of what we contributed is rate-based, okay? And it passed through the regulatory reviews and approvals. in order to satisfy three requirements. It had to meet the needs of the customer where it's sited. It had to provide value to the grid, but it also had to provide value to the ratepayer. Today marks the 1-year anniversary to the day of the commercial operation of this 12.5 megawatt microgrid, and this is only phase one. We have had no unplanned downtime, and Mark alluded and Jake alluded to frequency events. We've had 35 frequency response events, and the system, we dial in the frequency where we want the system to react. It all comes on, boosts the voltage, recovers the frequency, which not only helps our rate-paying customers that are on the same circuit, but it also helps the uptime of the data center. So it's a win-win-win for all parties. And this microgrid, by the way, is the most deeply embedded microgrid that I've ever seen. And I've been involved with data centers, not as long as Jake, for maybe about 10 years. So we basically have generation on the roof of the building where within 12 feet of the generator, we're coupled right to the server. So there's not a lot of utilities who even go behind the meter. We're deeply embedded, and without this relationship and this business model, we wouldn't have been able to have this happen.
And just to talk a little bit about maybe a little bit more details on frequency in data centers, this is becoming a big issue for data centers. And if you look at the growth of IT from a global perspective, IT is growing and the need for data centers in hot, flat, crowded parts of the world, places like India, Asia, Middle East, where the grid is not as stable as it is potentially in the US. And in some countries, the frequency of the grid is plus or minus 5%. So just a little primer, and there might be a couple people that want one on frequency. What happens on the grid is it's basically balanced at 60 hertz. When you increase the supply, the frequency goes up. When you decrease supply or increase demand, the frequency dips. And if you look at major outages on the grid, they are pretty much always preceded by some type of frequency event, dispatch plant. So when John talks about 35 events, what those are is a large peaker plant that was supposed to dispatch, didn't dispatch when it was supposed to, didn't start, and you'll see these frequency ripples on the grid. It doesn't mean that you have an outage, but you have a ripple. And IT equipment is sensitive from a power perspective. So we are dramatically more reliable because we are monitoring those ripples. Our data center will immediately start. We're considered what's called a tier 1 frequency asset. That means that we correct within the shortest amount of time. Typically we're correcting between 13 seconds, 15 seconds, something like that. Tier 1, I believe, is below 20. So we're immediately bracing and fixing that fluctuation. Now, if it turned out that it was an actual outage and it was going to be a major event, think of a data center. The whole model of a data center is to start your gens when the grid goes out. You just kind of wait there watching. We actually have a early warning system of the grid potentially having issues because we're seeing those frequency ripples. So imagine if you knew when the lights were going to go off, right? Which is a huge plus for a data center from a reliability perspective. So it's been a great partnership. I really give tremendous credit to the APS and the PowerSecure folks because and you see in these conferences, microgrids are a hot topic forever. But figuring out a business model, and especially working with utilities, and APS is a phenomenal utility, but they do, as John alluded to, they have, they're regulated, right? They have to meet a lot of regulations. So to work through the complexity of all of that, as well as deliver something as complex as a data center, it's been a great project and something that we're in discussions to continue to expand because it allows us to give our cloud players better performance, better efficiency, and greater reliability. So it truly is a win-win across the board.
Mark, can I ask, so the 2.5 gigawatts that you have, so how many systems is that?
Over 1,600 sites, and the microgrids are made up of various combinations of low emissions generation, energy storage, battery systems, fuel cells in some locations, integration, DC to DC integration of solar energy as well.
And are they all backup systems
Yeah,
generally,
so
they're reliability driven?
Great question. So yeah, our basic model is to provide a customer, mission critical customer with 100% standby power backup, also integrate those assets with the grid to take it, so it's kind of a win-win scenario. Just, and I think one of the reasons why microgrids have kind of stayed a science experiment in a lot of areas is because you really have to take this holistic view. And the three of us up here, it's really how it has to happen. Jake had, the value of a microgrid to him is resiliency, it's sustainability, carbon reduction, but mostly resiliency and business continuity for him. With utilities, they have value of our microgrids. Transmission and distribution constraints. John and I did another one down in Yuma, 25 megawatt microgrid, because it was at the very end of their system in the Cal ISO transmission lines, and so they felt the frequency events of everything coming, starting up in Washington State the whole way down through Arizona. So we put one in there that helps them address that issue. Another big part of this is that these systems can become non-spinning substitutes for spinning reserve. And let me explain that a little bit, because this is very important. When a customer says, hey, we're zero carbon at a site, we got solar, we buy wind, and we're zero carbon. Within their fence, they may be right. But the problem is the utilities then have to have spinning reserve for when the wind stops blowing or the sun goes behind a cloud, right? Well, they're not counting that. So it turns out that like utilities would have to, let's say we were talking about the duck curve, and at the end of the day, when the sun's going down, they have to keep assets spinning, turbines spinning all day long, waiting for that little 15-minute, 20-minute period, right? Well, guess what? Our systems can come up instantaneously with batteries, or well within 20 seconds. We beat the ramp time of actual larger turbines, so we don't spin. So instead of having that spinning reserve going, putting carbon in the environment all day long, waiting for that, it's kind of counterproductive, isn't it? So these microgrids are so successful at that, and in reducing the carbon across an entire utility platform versus just one entity. And so we all benefit, from that. So that's another value to the utility. Of course, everybody knows we do a bunch behind PJM, for instance. A lot of demand response there, a lot of peak load management. We talked about the duck curve. The other curve that's very important, it's our playground, is what we call the accumulated demand curve. And that's basically a curve that plots the amount of megawatts on a utility and how many hours that level exists throughout the year. And I'll give you one example. Behind PJM, there is 35,000 megawatts of load that only exists less than 300 hours out of the entire year. Now, do you maintain power plants to serve that? I mean, how do you serve that load? Guess what? These microgrids are perfect for that.
Yeah, Mark, all of those are really good points. A couple of points I want to make since we're here talking about digital is security. So for both the data center and the military base, where we have the other microgrid today, cybersecurity and control remotely is important. So with these systems, as a utility, we're pushing intelligence to the edge of the grid. These systems are completely autonomous. They're built in with a controller that if we lose communications, the system still runs. It can still detect a frequency event. It can still detect an outage. It can auto-reconfigure around a fault. It can detect high voltage. And with the addition of batteries, not only can we correct for low frequency, but we can correct for high frequency. So, it's really important, again, you're going to hear it holistically. You can buy bits and pieces anywhere, but integrating them, putting them together, and making sure that it's going to work the first time you throw the switch, to me, as a utility person now, that is the secret sauce behind a successful microgrid and the wannabe microgrids. And we spend a lot of time vetting a lot of different companies. In the case of PowerSecure, they were already pre-chosen by Aligned, but we still vet them anyway. And the relationship has been great. The track record speaks for itself. These grids are monitored 24/7 by PowerSecure in 2 separate locations. We also monitor it ourselves 24/7. We have 4 independent types of communication between all of the systems, between the utility aligned and PowerSecure. So we have redundancy on top of redundancy, because it's reliability, resiliency, and value that we create through the business model that's going to guarantee that these things stay in operation and produce the results.
So what's talked about a lot in microgrids as well as storage systems alone is this multi-value stream, right? So there's, as you guys have alluded to, there's value to the customer, there's value to the local utility, there's value at the wholesale level. So Mark, maybe talk a little bit, and then you guys can fill in as well, but when you say commercial viability, is the customer paying the sort of main freight in your systems, and the value to the wholesale and distribution customers are sort of gravy, or who pays and how? And I don't want you to betray any secret sauce here,
No,
but
it's all across. It's really all across the board. So we have a lot of customers that we actually provide 100% standby power to at 0 cost, 0 capital cost, and 0 change to their operating expense, because the incentives with the local utility are that significant. Now, these aren't incentives that you're going to see on the internet or anything. These are, we know how to create value. We know how to marry wholesale and retail rate incentives together to create the magic. Okay, and so yeah, that is kind of the proprietary and the secret sauce, but that's the key, and it's recognizing too that when you have all these buckets and everybody's just honest about it, that's when the real value can come, and we're blessed to have Arizona Public Service. They've just been awesome to work with, and everybody's been really transparent on value. And the worst thing you can do is, and this has happened for years and years, is customers with they would just beat up their local utility. There is no such thing as a free lunch. There isn't. And when you realize that, and everybody's said, okay, here's the value I'm going to derive, here's the value that you're going to derive, and we all come together in that works. The other thing is, with PowerSecure, we actually own 353 of those 1,600 microgrids. We own them. They're ours. So we'll put the numbers on the table. We'll put the cards on the table, and if somebody doesn't want to pick them up, we'll pick them up, because that's how sure we are about our numbers. So that helps too. And I'm sure John can address this too. With customers, when you talk about microgrids, they're not inexpensive, and so there's risk associated with that capital. There's risk associated with the operation. When we can team together like this, we basically eliminate the risk. We eliminate the fuel risk. We eliminate the rate risk, the rate change risk, the market risk by partnering at this level with our utilities.
And again, not to make you betray any secret sauce, but is that a multi-party contract then, or how, I mean?
I can give you some kind of general guidelines of the way
Okay.
we look at it in this site. So when you look at traditional energy storage or a traditional peaker plant, typically what's happening is one party is looking at that and seeing if there's a rate case to be made. Either you're a end user or a utility.
Sure.
And what I believe in significantly is you can make a much better business case if you're cost sharing and leveraging the same infrastructure for dual duty. So in the case of the generation, we're obviously using it for localized backup, and we have it immediately ready, allows us to invest. The utility is also getting the frequency response benefit. So much better deal for the utility, much better deal for the end user. And so by looking at these microgrids really from an ecosystem perspective and partnering up to do some of that cost sharing, significant advantages to both parties. And if you step back and just holistically look at utility structures out there, as you guys are all familiar, localized marginal pricing in these ISOs, you'll see it negative 25 cents. You'll see it up at 80 cents. So there's a huge business case here for energy storage, and there's a significant issue that is just increasing around frequency responsive. And we're, as a data center developer, we don't want to be part of the problem, i.e., just adding these more, ugly loads on the grid that need more stable infrastructure, making the problem worse and requiring utilities to put in more, non-green energy. We would rather see data centers, given the growth, given the size, it's the fastest growing user of energy globally. Why not make data centers part of the solution to address grid frequency and grid reliability? Because we're building data centers in 100 megawatt increments. I mean, these are large facilities, right? They're larger from a power draw than most small towns, right? So why not make them efficient? So we've been really focused. It doesn't touch on the energy side, but a typical 20 megawatt data center will use 100 million gallons of water, right, a year. They draw a huge amount of water. So one of the technologies that we developed internal to Align was a way to first cool data centers using 85% less water. And now we're actually, the second iteration of that product, which we're now rolling out into our data centers, can use no water. So imagine, per saving, $100 million, 100 million gallons of water. I mean, it's significant. And a place like Phoenix doesn't have a lot of water. So it's important. So it's been a great partnership, and that's something that the utility can also talk about and leverage from a sustainability perspective is the full, the full source there.
Yeah, a lot of times, when we talk about sustainability, we just talk about green and emissions, but water definitely comes into play in a place like Arizona. And there's some other benefits too. From the selfish side of the utility perspective, we love data centers because they're a nice flat load. They're not spiky. This relationship that we had allows the stranded asset cost, the investment. It allows Jake to reinvest that in expanding his data center, which only increases the load, which expands our capability to produce revenue, which again adds more microgrids, which increase the load. So it's a self-fulfilling cycle here that this relationship is the only way that we could have had that happen. Phoenix, being as hot as it is in the summer, isn't necessarily considered, or hasn't been because of the water issues, a bastion for data centers. But with this technology, especially the water-saving technology that Align has, it creates now this opening where we can attract a lot more customers like data centers, but we also use the same technology for other mission-critical applications, such as military bases for first responders of our military, hospitals, schools, and other places like wastewater and water treatment. When there's a major event like an earthquake or whatever, one of the biggest issues is providing fresh water, but also taking care of the waste. Okay, so we also put microgrids, battery storage, and solar systems at wastewater treatments as well.
Interesting. So Jake, I assume Align has hundreds of data centers.
Nope.
No. How many data centers do you have, and how many are microgrids, or do you see this as a new thing that you're going to roll out?
Yeah, so I'm chief technology. I also founded the company. So we started building data centers and really started ramping up about 4 years ago.
Okay.
So we have a very large facility in Phoenix that we can expand up to 120 megawatts of capacity. We have another large facility in Dallas, and we're currently moving into 2 additional markets, and a third on the way. So, we're pretty fast moving from a data center perspective, but the data center industry is one that is experiencing significant growth. So our peers are also in that same boat.
And how many are your peers looking at microgrids as well, or is this something you uniquely offer to clients?
I think that we're unique in the space. The data center that we're talking about specifically in Phoenix is the first of its kind. You need to kind of rethink data centers a little bit to do this. Traditional data center designs have UPS infrastructure and generation infrastructure that don't integrate with the grid. So it's not that it can't be done, it's just a matter of kind of rethinking and changing. We wanted to really focus on this for 2 main reasons. Number one, data centers are all about reliability, and we saw a significant opportunity to dramatically increase the reliability of data centers, which is something that customers want, so let's do it. And the other thing is that our customers and target customers are really these large, big brand name IT companies, cloud companies with, as we do, huge sustainability objectives.
Right.
And why not only make the data center more reliable, but also in so doing, make it much more sustainable. By having the data center interact with the grid, now much more green sources can come online, right? If you look in, especially in the Phoenix, California market, they have more solar at peaks than they know what to do with. Why not increase energy storage utilization, leveraging data centers so you can get, use that green energy and put more of it on the grid. So that's a strategic direction that the company started with and is taking, and it's growing, significantly more robust.
Nice.
And I'll jump into to brag on Jake a little bit. In the co-location data center world, they have developed a leadership position, period. Zero water, 85% less electricity for producing cooling. This type of microgrid technology, working with utilities, recognizing that they can be that non-spinning substitute for spinning reserve. So they've done an awesome job. We also do work with what we call the hyperscale. So these are all the household name, very large cloud players. And I can tell you about one microgrid we've completed. So, and I can't name the name of the company. This facility is in Silicon Valley, and it's a microgrid that has 16 megawatts of solar integrated through 5.46 megawatt hours of energy storage, 6 megawatts of our low emissions generation, and 4 megawatts of Bloom fuel cells. All integrated, can go seamlessly from utility to an islanded mode and back. And that system's used obviously for resiliency, but it's also used for energy cost arbitrage behind the Cal ISO grid, where Jake was saying before, you see prices from negative 25 cents, like they'll pay you to take electricity up to 80, 90 cents a kilowatt hour, and that all averages out probably to somewhere around 3 cents a kilowatt hour. But if you have these systems that can actually mitigate those risks, everybody wins.
Yeah, the microgrids, we have them as part of our energy imbalance market portfolio. Because of their fast start capability, we can respond to 5-minute calls for power, and we've actually dispatched the units in order to satisfy that need. Now that we've passed the 1-year test phase, we expect that that'll happen more often. And to find the right partners is important, because it's not every data center that would let you run the gens when the grid is up.
When you want it.
So we had to have a lot of discussions and create that mutual agreement, that binding 3-way agreement that says how we're going to run this thing and who gets priority under different conditions. We had to also, for this application, build a bidirectional substation, because power typically only flows one way for most utilities. So we also incorporated that in this design. That allows us to dispatch power if it's not needed for the data center, and put it to the grid. Because typically, data centers will put in more generation up front than they have load, because they're trying to attract customers. So that excess generation can be working for us even before the load comes.
Cool. I could keep asking questions for a while, but I want you all to have a chance, and I think these guys do too. So questions from the audience? Yeah, there's one right here.
So, Jimmy Chandler, Progressive Power. Question for Mark. I'm curious how much of your revenue, PowerSecure's revenue, comes from the guy on your left versus the guy on your right. In other words, you've got power electronics with immediate response that can provide services, transfer services such as bulk or frequency response. I'm picturing that in my mind as being like 1% of your revenue. 99% of your revenue is coming just being a standby power, backup power. So what is that?
No, it's the mix. So large-scale utility programs are probably, I don't know, at least 40%, I would say, of our fleet. And then virtually all of it, it's got to be more than 95%, is providing 100% standby power to the customer, but also is used for utility peak load management, non-spinning spinning reserve, operated by what we call utility-driven events, whatever those happen to be. If in some utilities it is purely duct curve mitigation. Okay. In other ones, it's more, that top 1 to 3% on their accumulated demand curve that could add up to hundreds of megawatts. We're using that. So instead of building plant, they're shutting down old, either emissions inefficient gas plants and old peakers, and using our systems as a non-spinning substitute for spinning reserve. So it's really the opposite, I think, of what you were thinking. It's 95% plus are used for both grid and for customer resiliency or sustainability.
I guess let me ask the same question maybe a slightly different way. How much of your energy, how much of what you do is a matter of switching peak load from this hour to this hour versus sub-cycle volt bar frequency response ancillary service?
I don't know the exact figure. So it's not so much moving peak time from one time to another. That would be mostly duct curve mitigation. It's when the utility really looking for the coincident peak across an entire RTO or ISO, and bringing that down efficiently and effectively so the whole ISO can operate with much less spinning reserve capacity is a big part of what we do. And then depending on the configuration of the particular microgrid, like for instance with our fuel cell, we have 97 megawatts of fuel cells that are actually integrated into the electric grid through battery energy storage. Fuel cells, they're like co-generators. They like to be ramped up to their optimum setting and not throttled. Right. Okay? They like to be nice and smooth. Well, batteries love to be throttled, right? So if the kind of the old when Bloom first came out, there were a lot of issues about reliability. Well, part of that was because they were connected directly to the grid. But now we're integrating them through our energy storage systems, and so we just let them do what they do best, and we throttle the batteries. In those particular cases, it's energy arbitrage that we're using for. It's sustainability. It's less emissions. It kind of brings it all together. And we do the same thing with our solar systems. DC to DC coupling, so you're actually controlling and you're not relying on the sun. So like I can tell you, we have in Puerto Rico, a lot of customers are on a time use rate. Well, the time use rate goes 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Well, that doesn't line up with the sun. So a lot of times you're producing solar energy when an off-peak time, so financial benefit isn't there. So when you integrate solar through energy storage, then you can control it and use it when the utility really needs it and not just when the sun shines. So John, they're doing a lot of creative things with that.
Yeah, but there might be other questions, so let's.
There was a question over here first, but right there, yeah.
Yes, I've got one. Oh, okay. Talk right into it. Eat it up. All right. So, so I'm a married guy, so I don't know exactly what Match.com does. I haven't been on the website, but I'm going to try one out here on you guys. I'm going to say that you are the results of a perfect match. Y'all have gone out searching for each other, and here the three of you are. On the left, on my left, we have a utility. In the middle, we got kind of an integrator, technology provider, and on the right, we have a customer who has very high, demands and requirements. And you guys have magically come together to create, the presentation you just gave us. So I've got a question for each one of you. If you just give me like 2 or 3. So, what are the top 3 things that people in your industry, your leaders, have to do in order to get this kind of magic to happen again and again and again? So like from a load perspective, people that are representing large loads, what is the mindset that you have to be thinking of to allow these other guys to decide, to join in with what's going on? Because the status quo in your industry is not what you're doing. And then the utility, we know from the utility perspective, you guys generally aren't thinking like what you've done here. And of course, the technology provider, I mean, he's always there, so I don't know.
He's always there.
So you got my drift there. Just, I mean, what do we need to leave out of here thinking as a mindset change to have this synergy you guys have put before us?
Yeah. Well, from a customer perspective, I'll kind of give you one from a customer and then, advice from a utility, because I spend a lot of time talking to utilities, so I won't name names, but give you. So from a customer perspective, it's really important to recognize that you can be a good steward and a driver of these projects. So rather than sitting waiting for the utility to do it unto themselves, you can come to them and be open about it and say, this is my needs, this is what I can contribute, and can we make this project work? So it really needs to be an interactive piece. And to that end, kind of the corollary from the utility side is, APS and there are a couple others, but we found, there's a lot of utilities out there that just aren't thinking outside the box, and they have these issues, and they're just not recognizing that if they go and speak to the right customers, the large data center providers, these are all sophisticated folks, and the big cloud companies, there's huge potential to create these types of projects that literally there's no downside. They're much more reliable. They're much better for the ratepayers. They're much better for bringing on green energy. And it really takes I think.
What I hear you say is the leaders in your industry need to be thinking about this before they make decisions and realize that this is an option.
Yeah.
I think that's where the big gap is.
Yep.
Yeah,
Same thing true for the utility.
well, from a utility perspective, even before I met Jake when I came on, the first thing I asked was, do we even know who our high-use customers are and which ones have generation? That took a couple of months to pull that together. So we had all the information on our interconnect records, but no one had ever really looked at it. They see an interconnect come by, up to the meter is all we typically have looked at, and what they do behind the meter, as long as they don't violate our policies, go at it. So I went on a campaign and visited every single customer that had a megawatt or more of generation to find out, what do you use your generation for? Do you plan to expand? Would you be interested in this kind of product? What would you be willing to share, right? What's your threshold? So we looked at a lot of projects, and we couldn't make we had about 6 companies interested. We couldn't make about 4 of them pencil out. And it was all open book. We went to them, we said, here's the best we can do. It's not going to work. So we have an active program. We continually look at every application that comes in, and we also have an engineering group that looks at our grid and looks for load pockets, looks for opportunities for transmission and distribution deferral. For example, we may have a customer that only has a single line going to it today, but now because of reliability, they want a second feed from a substation 200 miles away. Putting in a microgrid might be a better solution, more cost effective, and meets all these other requirements and other services than spending the ratepayer money on putting in another line. And then if that company ends up leaving, now you've got this invested infrastructure that may not be needed for the next company that may come in. So we view these assets as fungible, they're modular, they're movable. So, we couldn't be more happy with how the pieces came together. Yeah. And nothing breeds success like success. So after a year and a half's worth of great results, we're committed to do more.
There's one quick thing I want to add just on that question and to the group. Utilities are, to John's point, are in a really unique position to create or foster ecosystems. And so if you look at, the world today, 50% of the world's energy is tied up in low-grade waste heat that gets dumped in streams, goes up stacks. Technologies are out there, and we're very interested in working with several of them, where you can do low-grade, waste heat recovery to power, right? So there's a huge opportunity there. Water ecosystems where one person is, their wastewater is perfectly good for cooling a data center, right? Why go out and, use more potable water? So there's a huge opportunity there for energy ecosystems.
Last question here, if it's quick. We're running out of time.
Question. So a lot of the use cases were larger scale projects. I'm just speak right into it. Thanks. A lot of the use cases were larger scale projects on data centers, and I'm just curious how it can scale down to the grocery store level or even to the bank, and what are the difficulties with scaling this down?
Great question. We probably have, I don't know, 1,000 grocery stores. Walmart is a customer of ours. We have combinations there of Bloom fuel cells, low emission generation, some integration of solar, depending on utility incentives in the area. So I think our smallest microgrid's actually at some military installations that are in the 50 to 100 kW range. I can't tell you about them because they're top secret, but we have those all the way up to I think one site 41 megawatts is our largest. But yeah, it definitely scales down. One of the things that's happened is because of the new EPA rules for stationary generation, now the emissions of small generators can actually be cleaner than the emissions of very large peaking gas plants, natural gas plants. So that has all changed in the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. We are cleaner in 7 out of 8 pollutants compared to a GELM 6,000 100 megawatt turbine. Okay, it's actually 7 out of 8. We're 7 out of 8 cleaner. Okay, so that's happened. The other thing that's happened is battery costs coming down and continue to come down. So that the smaller scale, I mean, that's going to change the face of the industry yet again. We've had this big conversation this morning about where all that's going. So yeah, it's an exciting time.
What are the difficulties in scaling down?
Pardon me?
What are some of the difficulties with scaling it down? Is it just... It's
just getting the cost down at a lower, because whether you have a 1 megawatt system or a 100 kW system, there's a lot of the same things have to happen, right? The paralleling with the utility, all that kind of stuff. So there's fixed costs. So it's once those variable components come down, like battery costs, like generation costs, which they are, low emissions generation costs, that's what's helping to drive it, frankly.
From a utility perspective, though, the answer is a little more nuanced. So we typically have our threshold of about 2 megawatts, because on top of the equipment and everything that we purchase, we also have to add our own controls capability, our own cybersecurity. We've got loads and things that we have to put on every project. There's project management and other things. So we've penciled it out, and we're saying about 2 megawatts for these microgrids. However, in an aggregated model, if you could aggregate enough grocery stores under the same control platform to come up to that 2 megawatts, we could do that as well.
It's great. I think we're out of time. I want you to thank the panel. It's a great panel.